The alarms on Ashkar Reach had been screaming for 11 days, and on the 11th day they simply stopped, because there was nothing left of our defense grid for them to warn us about. My name is Vesa Cannell, third daughter of the Thessari Dominion, and when the last message came from the border fleet, I was standing in the war chamber on Thessar Prime, watching a map that used to show 400 of our ships and now showed 6. The Sol Compact had broken a defense line that held for 300 years against every enemy we had ever known. They had done it in 11 days. Our admirals stood around that table with faces gone gray, because none of them could explain how a smaller, younger fleet had done what the Creole armadas never managed in 3 centuries of trying. I was not a soldier. I was not a strategist. I was a daughter of the ruling house, third in line, mostly useful for ceremonies and treaties, and standing quietly in rooms while older, more important people decided things. But that night, the High Marshal turned to my mother, the regent, and said the only sentence that mattered. The humans have offered terms. They will stop the fleet if the Dominion agrees to a marriage between their crown prince and a daughter of the ruling house. Every eye in that room turned to me. I had 11 hours to decide whether to become a bride or watch my homeworld burn. I did not need 11 hours. I said yes before my mother finished asking the question, because 400 billion lives were heavier than any fear I had of a stranger's hand on mine. 3 days later, I was aboard a shuttle bound for Earth, wearing wedding silk instead of armor, flying toward a man I had never met, to marry into a species my tutors had spent my whole childhood warning me about. They fight without counting the cost, my war instructors used to say. They throw ship after ship, life after life, into battles that should be unwinnable, and somehow they keep winning anyway. Pity them. They are savage beneath their manners. Never trust a species that treats its own lives so cheaply. I believed every word of that, right up until the moment I actually met one of them. The receiving hall on Titan Station was full of cameras and diplomats, and the particular kind of silence that surrounds a transaction dressed up as a wedding. I stood at one end in silk the color of my homeworld's twin sons, and at the other end stood Daniel Ashworth, Crown Prince of the Sol Compact, and he was nothing like what I had braced myself for. He was young, tall, and tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. When he took my hand for the ceremony, he held it like something breakable, and when he spoke his vows, he looked at me instead of the cameras, instead of his father the regent, instead of the banners of 2 governments hanging behind us. He looked at me like I was a person, and not a peace treaty with a pulse. "I am sorry," he said quietly, after the ceremony ended and the cameras finally left. "I know what it means to lose your freedom to save people who will never know your name." I did not understand, then, what he meant by that. I would spend the next year finding out. The war ended within the week. The Dominion kept its core worlds. We paid tribute our economists called generous for a defeated power, and I moved into the Ashworth residence on Earth, into a life built entirely out of rooms I did not choose, and customs I did not understand. Humans ate with strange 3-pronged tools and argued about the correct way to hold them. They slept in cycles that made no sense against any calendar I knew. They laughed loudly and cried quietly, and my new husband did both more than anyone I had ever met, though the crying only ever happened at night, when he thought I was asleep. It took me 4 months to work up the courage to ask him why. It happened on an evening in early autumn, on a balcony overlooking a garden that smelled nothing like home, with a bottle of something amber and burning between us that he called whiskey, and never seemed to actually enjoy. "I need to ask you something," I said, "and I need you to answer honestly, because I have been lied to about your people my whole life, and I would like, for once, to know the truth from someone who actually lived it." He turned the glass slowly in his hand. "Ask," he said, "why do your fleets never stop coming? My teachers told me it was because you value life so little that you will spend any number of soldiers to win a battle. But I have lived here 4 months now, and I have watched you weep for a stranger's death on the evening news. That is not a man who values life cheaply. So explain it to me. Why does humanity never lose?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought he might not answer at all. Then he set the glass down, untouched, and began. "It is not that we do not lose people, Vesa," he said. "We lose everyone eventually. Every soldier, every ship, every city we have ever built. We have lost some version of at some point. What we do not lose is the will to keep fighting after that happens. And there is a reason for that, and it is not a pleasant one. 200 years ago, before the Compact, before any of the treaties you have studied, humanity almost did not survive itself. We do not talk about it much anymore, not in the histories your tutors would have read. There was a war, the last purely human war, fought with weapons that did not care about borders or armies. Weapons that poisoned the air and the water and the ground for a generation. By the time it ended, we had come within a handful of years, by the best estimates historians still argue about, of losing everything, not losing a war, losing the species. I sat very still, because I had never heard this part of human history in any Dominion record. We do not teach children the details, he continued, because the details are the kind of thing that scars a mind rather than educates it. But we teach them the shape of it. We teach them that we stood at the edge of extinction once, by our own hand, and that the only reason any of us are alive to tell the story is that enough people, in enough places, refuse to let it be the end. Not because a government ordered them to, because something older than government took over. Call it instinct, call it memory passed down in the blood, even to those of us born centuries after it happened. We do not know how to stand quietly at the edge of an ending. We never learned that skill, because the one time we needed it, we did not have it, and it nearly cost us everything. So when your border fleet met ours at Ashkar Reach, he said, your admirals were counting ships and comparing losses, because that is how your dominion has always measured a war. 300 years without facing true extinction will teach a species to think that way. It is not wrong. It is simply not how we count. Our commanders were not doing loss projections against your fleet. They were doing math against an old memory none of them ever lived through personally, but all of them carry anyway. And you cannot outweight an enemy that has already decided losing is not a line on a ledger. To us, losing is the whole story ending. And nothing, no admiral, no treaty, no order to retreat, is allowed to be the reason the story ends. I sat with that for a long moment, before I found my voice again. Then why did you agree to this? I asked. To a marriage? To a peace, instead of finishing a war you were already winning. If losing is truly unthinkable to you, why stop short of victory? And for the first time since our wedding day, I saw him almost smile, though there was no joy in it. Because winning a war was never the actual point, Vesa. Surviving is the point. And a species that nearly ended itself once learns, eventually, that surviving means fighting fewer wars, not winning more of them. We agreed to this marriage, because a wedding costs less than a graveyard, on both sides. I am glad it stopped there. I am glad your people did not have to learn what mine already knows. He reached across the small table between us and took my hand, and this time it was not for the cameras, not for the treaty, not for anyone watching. It was only for me. You did not marry a conqueror, he said. You married the thing conquerors are afraid of. A people who will burn everything, including ourselves, before we let the ending happen again. I know that frightened your admirals. It frightens most of the species we meet, but I would rather you understand it than fear it. There is a difference between the two, and I think, given time, you might come to see it. I did not answer him that night. I only held his hand, and watched the strange, unfamiliar stars over Earth, and thought about everything I had been taught to fear. The months that followed taught me more than any of my tutors ever had. I learned that Daniel's mother, the Dowager Regent Charlotte, kept a small garden behind the residence, where she grew flowers from a country that no longer existed on any modern map, a country lost during that same old war, and she tended it every morning before dawn as quietly as a prayer. I learned that his younger sister, Grace, who piloted survey ships along the outer compact border, kept a small stone from a place called the Old Coastline in her flight jacket, worn smooth from centuries of hands passing it down before hers. I learned that humans did not speak of their history the way we spoke of ours. We recited victories. They kept small, quiet objects, and small, quiet silences, and let those speak instead. A year into my marriage, the Dominion sent a formal delegation to Earth to review the treaty terms, led by my mother's chief strategist, a hard old officer named Torvek, who had commanded fleets before I was born. He met with Daniel and his war council for 3 days, and on the third evening, he found me alone in the residence gardens and asked me, bluntly, whether I believed the humans could be trusted not to break the peace once it suited them. I told him what Daniel had told me, that the peace suited them more than any victory could, because for humanity, every war, no matter how small, was measured against the memory of the one war that nearly ended them all. Torvek listened, and for a long time he said nothing, and then he told me something I had not expected. He said that during the 11 days of the border campaign, Compact commanders had sent 3 separate offers of ceasefire before the marriage proposal ever reached Dominion ears, and that Dominion Command had rejected every one of them, certain that a species fighting so recklessly could be worn down through simple patience. It was only when the ceasefire offers stopped and the marriage proposal arrived instead that anyone in the war chamber understood the humans had never wanted to fight that war at all. They had wanted it to end as quickly and as bloodlessly as possible, and a wedding was simply the fastest way they knew to make that happen. We misread them completely, Torvek admitted, and it is the only mistake in my career I am not ashamed to have made, because I do not think any of us could have understood a species like this without living among them the way you have. That conversation changed something in me. I stopped studying humans the way I had been trained to study enemies, cataloging weaknesses, searching for the crack that would explain their strange resilience. I started studying them the way you study people you might, eventually, come to trust. 2 years into the marriage, a crisis on the Compact's far border pulled Daniel away for several months, called to a diplomatic post near a contested system where tensions with a third species, the Halvanari, had begun to rise. I asked to go with him, and after some argument with the council, I was permitted, officially as a cultural liaison, unofficially because Daniel refused to leave without me. It was there, on a cold station orbiting a gas giant with 3 moons, that I finally saw for myself what my old tutors had never managed to explain. The Halvanari were pressing a border claim with increasing aggression, testing Compact patience the way, I now understood, our own Dominion once had. Daniel spent weeks in negotiation, patient, careful, offering compromise after compromise, absorbing insults that would have shamed a Dominion prince into demanding satisfaction. I asked him, one evening, why he tolerated so much before responding. Because the moment we stop negotiating, he said, is the moment this becomes something neither side can walk back from. I would rather spend 100 meetings being patient than 1 battle being right. Winning an argument costs nothing. Winning a war costs everything, even when you are the one who wins it. The Halvanari eventually withdrew their claim, not because they were defeated, but because Daniel gave them a path to leave the table with their pride intact. I watched him do it, and I understood, finally, that the same instinct that made humanity fight without counting the cost also made them negotiate without counting their pride. Both came from the same old scar. Both came from a species that had learned, at the worst possible cost, that endings were not something to risk carelessly, in either direction. We returned to Earth as the crisis eased, and it was there, a few months later, that I gave birth to our daughter, a small, dark-haired girl we named Ellen, after my grandmother, though Daniel insisted her middle name be Rose, after his own grandmother, a woman who had survived the old war as a child and lived long enough to see her grandson become crown prince. Holding her for the first time, I understood something I had not expected to understand as clearly as I did. Ellen was neither fully Thesari nor fully human. She was something new, born from 2 peoples who had once stood ready to destroy each other, and instead chose, at the very last possible moment, to build something together instead. I write this account now, a decade into a marriage I did not choose and would not now trade for any life I once imagined for myself. As senior advisor to the Thesari Liaison Office, the first Dominion-born official ever granted a permanent seat in the Compact's Council of Allied Species. I still study humans, though not the way I once did. I study them now, the way you study family, with patience, with curiosity, and with the quiet understanding that some scars run deeper than any treaty can measure. Here is what 10 years among them has taught me, and what I would tell any envoy preparing to test humanity's resolve, or any bride sent, as I once was, to secure a peace she does not yet understand. They are not fighting you. Not really. Every battle they enter is fought against the ghost of an ending they almost did not survive. and every piece they offer is built from the same memory, only turned the other direction. You cannot outweight a people who are not afraid of losing to you, because the war they are truly fighting was decided 200 years ago, quietly, on their own dying world, and everything since has only ever been about making sure that ending never comes again. That is why humanity never loses. They already did, once. And they have spent every year since making certain the universe never gets a second chance to finish what that old war started. My daughter is 7 years old now. She has her father's eyes and my grandmother's stubborn chin, and last spring, when I finally told her the story of the old war, the one her father's people rarely speak of aloud, she asked me a question that neither of us expected her to ask. If they were so afraid of losing everything, she said, why did they choose to have children at all? Wouldn't it have been safer not to? I thought about that for a long time before I answered her. Because being afraid of an ending, I told her, is not the same as giving up on a beginning. Your father's people learned that lesson the hardest way any species ever can. And they chose, every single day since, to keep beginning anyway. She thought about that for a while, in the quiet, careful way she has that reminds me so much of her father, and then she nodded, satisfied, and went back to her games, the way children do, carrying a truth she was still too young to fully understand, but old enough to keep. I watched her go, and thought about the girl I had been, 10 years earlier, boarding a shuttle bound for a stranger's world, certain I was walking toward my own ending. I had been wrong. I had been walking, without knowing it, toward a beginning instead. And so, I have come to believe, is every piece worth having.